An EGD, also called esophageal gastroduodenoscopy, is a scope that we use to look into the esophagus, into the stomach, and to part of the small intestine. That really helps us to diagnose cancer, especially involving the esophagus, cancer involving the stomach, or even into the small intestine. It also allows us to look into the esophagus if anyone has difficulty swallowing. It's one of the very first things that you might want to do is consider an EGD, is to look into the esophagus to see what's causing that difficulty swallowing. Is it a stricture? Is it a tumor? Is it inflammation? Or is it an infection? It's also the first thing that you would consider if someone's passing blood, like from an ulcer. So if you have an ulcer, oftentimes an ulcer originates in the stomach or the small intestine. You can see that very clearly with an EGD. Does it help to look only? It does help to look only, but you can do something about it. We have the means now, if it's an ulcer that's bleeding, is to stop the bleeding. We can use injection of medication into the ulcer that will control the bleeding, and oftentimes we use cautery. Cautery means it's a technique where we apply heat over that bleeding area, and that just dries the tissue up and stops the bleeding. So it's very helpful then to look for bleeding sites from an upper gastrointestinal source. We also use the EGD to help us place stents. Oftentimes when people are unable to swallow because of an obstructive mass in the esophagus, we can put a stent in, just like we talked about a stent using it in the bile ducts. We can put a stent in the esophagus. It keeps it open where you can swallow. You're able to swallow liquids, you can swallow solids. And during your treatment then, that stent will stay in, and then when the treatment is completed, the stent will come out. And then you'll be able to swallow again like you had previously. We also use the EGD to put stents in the small intestine. For instance, if there's an obstruction there beyond the stomach, where food goes into your stomach but it can't pass out, oftentimes a stent can be placed in that area where the obstruction is to where you're able to swallow now. We also use an EGD for different types of treatments. For instance, if we want to shrink down a tumor, we can shrink down a tumor by using an EGD and using different instruments.